Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. It is exactly 1 o'clock. Let me stop sharing my screen. Come on to say hello. Hi, everybody. I want to thank you for joining us today. I really hope that it's finding you healthy and feeling supported during this time, which is incredibly strange for all of us, but more than strange for many of us, incredibly difficult. I'm Mel Fowler Green. I'm the director at the Metro Human Relations Commission, and I'm honored to be joined today by Ashford Hughes Sr., a consultant on equity, diversity, and inclusion, the former Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Metro Government, and a great colleague and friend in this work. Before we get started, just some logistics. If you're having any audio issues, you might want to listen by calling in on a phone instead of using your computer audio. So you can watch the video on the computer, but listen to the audio from your phone. And everyone except for Ashford and I are muted, but we do want your participation. So to do that, this platform has a Q&A function, a question and answer function. You can find the little box down on the bottom right corner of the screen. And if you will type in any questions that you have for Ashford and I'm going to do my level best to get to all your questions. And we are recording this session, so you should be able to share it with colleagues, with friends once we're done. And I'll send out a link for that once it's ready. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I know people are still trickling in. But I want to introduce my co-panelist, Ashford Hughes.
Mel, can you hear me?
I certainly can.
Hey, how you doing this morning?
Afternoon, all right.
I should say. I want to thank you first, Mel, and the Human Relations Commission for offering up this important opportunity and conversation to speak about an equity lens, what the city of Nashville can do to utilize this apparatus moving forward. So thank you again. Looking forward to this conversation.
Well, good. Me too. I appreciate that. And we're going to go ahead and let you start us off. Okay. We'll share. Just give me a second here. And Ashford, are you able to see your first slide?
Yep.
Okay, great. Then.
Whenever you're ready, I'll go ahead and jump in.
All right. I'm going to turn off my video and mute myself. And please just say next slide, and I will be happy to forward the slide for you.
Okay, thanks, Mel. For everybody on the webinar today, thank you for being here. You know, you being on here is the first step into really addressing and making certain that this issue of equity within our community and the way that we operationalize it is important to the city moving forward, especially post-COVID. Go to the next slide, please, Mel. Now, while we are really here to get to understanding, you know, what is an equity lens? How can we use it to articulate and operationalize racial equity goals for the city? I do think it is vitally important that we take some time just quickly to understand what we're talking about here. So when you first think of the phrase, the water is still rising, what does that mean for our ethnic minority and immigrant communities in Nashville? We think that this is the 10-year anniversary year of our Nashville flood. And still, 10 years later, we still see that these communities, the Black community, brown community, still are having to overcome obstacles associated with the flood, now associated with a tornado, that until we begin to fully integrate the ideas around equity, our communities will continue to be always dealing with rising waters. Next slide, Mel. Now, this is something that I think is, very understandable as well. To many communities, inequity is not a concept they talk about, but a very real thing they experience every day. The COVID now outbreaks underlines that and not highlights that, but amplifies it much more so today. This is another reason why the utilization of an equity lens is so vitally important for our community moving forward to really move beyond the understanding of the inequities into moving towards the solution-driven processes to alleviate these inequities. Communities see this every day. Black community, the brown community have been highlighting and advocating for these inequities prior to COVID. Now is the time that we can operationalize these. But we first have to have a concrete understanding of what we mean by equity. Next slide, Mel. It is important as we begin to talk about an equity lens that we have the same understanding and grounding of what equity truly is and what are we trying to accomplish when we discuss equity. We look at a definitive understanding is that equity is about eliminating difference-based, race-based outcome gaps so that there are no predictors of one's success. What we really talk about is that we want to make certain in Nashville, in our country, that race, zip code, gender does not play a role in the successful outcomes and the prosperity of individuals that we live and mingle with on a day-to-day basis. We look at this approach, which is so vitally important, that it centers on the historically marginalized and moves from a service-based, program-based approach towards focus on policies, institutions, and structures. While I think that it's so very important that we differentiate equity from equality, because we're trying to make certain we are achieving equity, which is justice and fairness. Equality is along the lines of sameness. And we know as of right now, policies that equate to sameness would not bring us into addressing the inequities, the lifetime inequities that we see in Black and brown communities. As someone put it to me, equality is leaving the door open for anyone who has the means to approach. Equity is ensuring there is a pathway to that door for those who need it. It is so very important that we have a functional understanding of racial equity moving forward. Next slide, Mel. It is also important that we have an understanding of what we are trying to address when we talk about racial equity. We are talking about structural racism, institutionalized racism. Where we are sometimes in our city and in other cities is that we individualize racism too often, where it is, well, I am not racist, or are we calling said person in the department racist? We are looking at structures, past policy procedures that have predated where we are now that have led to the inequities that we see. Structural racism refers to a system of social structures that produces cumulative legacies, individuals, and structures that work interactively to distribute material and symbolic advantages and disadvantages along racial lines. We are talking, when we talk about an equity lens and working for equity, dismantling and disrupting systems of oppression and system of disparities. Next slide, Mel. As we begin to, in my next two slides, discuss an racial equity lens, I think it's important that we have to also let the data show us why this is important for a little bit as well. This is one slide of a study that was done in Nashville with the Nashville Chamber of Commerce, along with the Brookings Institute, a public policy think tank organization that looks at how equitable and inclusive cities are. You can see that during the time from 2007 to 2017, Nashville experienced, in conjunction with our peer cities, high levels of job growth. You looked at the prosperity in our city per capita. We were equivalent to, if not better than, some of our peer cities. But when you looked into the inclusion of that growth, the inclusion of that prosperity, you will see the negative stance that Nashville was taking. This is problematic that leads to these inequities that the data continues to show in us. We just recently passed or were given our community needs evaluation survey for 2019, which continue to amplify these same data points that were screaming, we need an equity lens. We need to build a community based along the lines of racial equity profile. African American poverty in Davidson County is upwards of 25%. The overall poverty in Nashville increased in Nashville over the last year and a half to 15%, but African American poverty is at 25%. African American unemployment in Davidson County is double that of our white counterparts. Double that. So that means individuals are not able to close the racial wealth gap in our city. Nashville ranks in the bottom 6% of cities our size in this country for intergenerational mobility. That means that from generation to generation, a young person's opportunity to advance economically beyond their parents is vitally low here in Davidson County. These are data points that are given to us that we need to address. Half of workers in Davidson County make $35,000 or less. And finally, 25% of our students live in poverty. These are issues that we must address via looking at it through the lens of equity and applying an equity lens when we look at institutional and governmental change. Next slide, Mel. So as we begin to look at specifically what is an equity lens, how do we begin to operationalize an equity lens? An equity lens is a set of our city values, questions that clearly articulates our shared goals that we have for the city, the intentional policies, our intentional investments and systematic change that we look to make to be able to reach our goals of a more equitable city to alleviate some of the inequalities that we see. An equity lens confirms the importance of recognizing institutional and systematic barriers of discriminatory practices that have limited access and success for many people in our community. Some questions that you see along the lines of equity lenses are that you would ask before you set the policy forward. What are the racial, ethnic, and underserved groups that are affected by this issue, by this policy decision, by this allocation of funds? What is the potential impact of this resource allocation and strategic investment to these groups? How are we collecting data on race and ethnicity and native language as we make this policy, as we make this financial allocation, this investment? Does this decision being made ignore or worsen existing disparities or produce other unintended consequences? What is the impact of eliminating these opportunity gaps? An equity lens puts into sight the shared values of including people that are marginalized right now in the conversation to make certain that they are involved in the decision-making process. An equity lens begins with asking ourselves the questions: are we getting the things that we deserve? And are we willing to stand with and elevate the voices of those who are not? Next slide, Mel. Again, when we look at an equity lens, it asks us several questions before we make decisions. Who does this decision best impact? Who has the opportunity and who does not? Whose voices are at the table? Who is included and who are not? I like to think of an equity lens as we look at this process and move forward along the three major P's: people, power, process, and place. These are the four key P's that we need to evaluate in a lens when we make decisions on issues, resource allocation moving forward. I'll take each of those piece by piece just in one question. When we look at the people, when we make a decision at the government level, who is going to be affected by this decision that we're going to make and how? Are there current disparities that exist and how will they be impacted? How will these people be impacted? When we look at the place of an equity lens, how are we accounting for people's emotional and physical safety and their need to feel productive and valued? How are we looking at their place when we make these decisions? Power. What are the barriers to incorporating equity and racial justice work? What are the benefits and burdens that these communities experience with this particular issue, with this particular funding opportunity? And then process. What policies, processes, and relationships contribute to the exclusion of communities most affected by these inequities? This is what the equity lens, this set of values, this set of question making seeks to pull out as we move forward with where our city needs to be. But important to that conversation, important to an equity lens, and some would say they go hand in hand, one may go before the other, and you can go to the next slide, Mel, is that we have to have, as a city, as an organization, as an institution, a set of equity-laced goals. We have to know where we're trying to get to before we can begin to put a lens around where we're trying to keep and hold people accountable for in being more inclusive. Right now, if you look at some of the cities that set particular equity goals in order to have a lens, be able to characterize and express values on what they want to see, some of the goals that I've seen in other cities are wrapped around ending racial disparities within city government alone, so that there is fairness in hiring, promotions, greater opportunities in contracting, and equitable services to all residents. Other goals have included strengthening outreach and public engagement and access to city services for communities of color and immigrant and refugee communities, and support or change existing services using racial equity best practices. Another goal that I've seen that has been beneficial to pulling all of this together is collaborating with communities. We will collaborate with communities and institutions to eliminate racial inequities in all areas of government, including education, criminal justice, environmental justice, health, housing, transportation, and economic success. We have to have the goals, we have to have the broader, the big vision of what equity looks like so that we can administer an equity lens to make certain that we are evaluating the policies, the investments, and there's accountability that those policies and investments are reaching those that need these the most based off of statistical data. I always highlight the absolute necessity for data to lead the way, and the data is showing the need for a racial equity lens. Next slide, Mel. As I close out, these, number one, is really one of the most important reasons that I see us needing to vision bigger for the city, move beyond where we are in the thought process around equality, but move towards equity. Our city by 2040, our demographics are changing. We will have no majority race or ethnicity in Nashville. That is going to force us to operate as a different city. COVID-19 is going to force us to operate as a different city because right now, going back to normal is not operable for our African American community, for our immigrant community, in order to address the inequities. Going back to normal without applying a racial equity lens, having institutional conversations around racialized equity and policy will lead to the exasperation of these disparities that we saw coming before COVID, coming before the tornado. Last slide, Mel. This is just, and I'm sure Mel will share these as well. These are just some national resources, organizations that are having this conversation across the country. I've been fortunate enough, as working within the mayor's office and now outside of the mayor's office, to work with a lot of national partners, a lot of peer cities that are in the same struggle as we are in Nashville, but are challenging city officials, challenging elected officials to move more in a manner of equity along the lines of race, along the lines of gender. We can no longer allow the norm to continue. We can no longer allow a person's zip code to be able to guarantee or unguarantee their success in life. Right now, that is where we are. Now is the time that we can operationalize equity, and now is the time that we can create a list of shared valued questions to make certain that we are keeping the policies and keeping the investments accountable to creating opportunities for those in our community that most need those opportunities created for them. Thanks, Mel.
Well, thank you very much, Ashford. And if you all, participants, attendees, have questions for Ashford, you can put those in your little Q&A. But I am going to continue the presentation with some descriptions of how other cities have been able to use an equity lens, and how what ideas we might have or opportunities we might have here in Nashville to replicate some of that good work, or to create our own forms of equity lens. So, promising practices from other cities. And I do want to add, I too had the great benefit of working with some national organizations, particularly PolicyLink, in looking at what some other cities were doing and seeing what kind of results they were getting. 3 cities I want to concentrate on: Seattle, Washington, Baltimore, Maryland, and San Antonio, Texas. So Seattle is often mentioned in this work. Is 2004. They were the first U.S. city to establish a program that was really explicitly about addressing institutional and systemic racism. And they spent several years developing a toolkit that lays out a process, a set of questions to guide the city in the development, implementation, and evaluation of policies, initiatives, programs, and budget in order to address the impacts on racial equity. Their process is much like the one that Ashford shared with you. It's a 6-step analysis, right? First, we got to set outcomes or set goals, right? What is it that we want to achieve? Involve stakeholders, right? The people who are actually affected. And then analyze data, and not just aggregate data, but to do equity work really requires that we commit to disaggregated data. That is data that reveals to us disparities across difference, like gender, race, language access. Right? So if we can pull apart the data based on those things, then we are better able to assess what disparities there are. The third step for Seattle, right? Determine the benefit of the burden, advance opportunity or minimize harm, evaluate and raise racial awareness, accountability, and reporting back. And their toolkit, I want to share a little bit, where I'm not going to cover this exhaustively, but I wanted you to see what exactly that toolkit looks like. So this is the set of questions that they use. And anytime there's a blue wording that hyperlinks to a set of definitions or guidance. And so, of course, setting the outcome, right? What does your department define as the most important racially equitable community outcomes related to the policy, initiative, program, or budget issue that you're working on? What are the opportunities or opportunity areas that the issue is going to primarily impact, right? And their community had identified education, community development, health, environment, criminal justice, jobs, and housing is important, which I'm pretty sure nearly all communities are going to identify those as well. Their impacts on, are we talking about contracting? Are we talking about workforce, immigrant and refugee access, or, inclusive outreach and public engagement? The second step is, who's impacted? What geographic areas in the city are impacted by the policy or initiative? What are the racial demographics of those living in that area? How have you involved the community members and stakeholders? And of course, what is the data and your conversation with stakeholders, which also leads me to want to say, right, I agree completely with Ashford that, data is critical to analyzing whether or not we are reaching the equity goals, or to even assess the disparities to inform our equity goals. But let's not also forget that information and lived experience from constituents and from stakeholders, that is data, right? So I think that I really like how they have combined data and then conversations with stakeholders to tell you about existing racial inequities that influence people's lives and what should be taken into consideration. And this was interesting to me. Seattle and some other equity lenses ask the departments to think about what the root causes or factors that might be creating those racial inequities, right? So do you think there might be a bias in the process? Is there historical, systemic discrimination that we have yet to remedy? Right? Lack of, do we see these racial inequities because we haven't done a particularly good job at being racially inclusive in our community engagement? Then the third step, how will the policy, initiative, program, or budget issue increase or decrease racial equity? So given what you learned from the data and the stakeholder involvement, based on that, how will you address the impacts, including what might be unintended consequences on racial equity? Evaluate, right? How are you going to evaluate and be accountable on the back end? If you've identified ways to structure your program, your initiative, your allocation of resources, how are you going to be accountable, or how are you going to measure whether you're meeting the kind of equity goals that you set out? And then, what is left unresolved? And then 6, reporting back, right? Sharing the analysis and report with department leadership and others who, Seattle or who the city has viewed as needing that information. So here is, so the way Seattle uses this particular tool right, is they require each department to use the toolkit to analyze a minimum of 4 projects each year to guide policy, program, and budget decisions. They have change teams, which are groups of employees who advocate for race and social justice initiative programs. They facilitate and participate in discussions on race, racism, and strategies to overcome the institutional barriers to racial and social inequity. The budget office requires departments to use the toolkit to analyze every budget proposal, or as we call here in Metro, a budget improvement. City managers have been trained to use the toolkit to review policies, programs, and projects. And the council requires all departments to report on the progress of annual race and social justice initiative work plans. The work plans that are using this toolkit. I should also say that, Seattle reports that, this system and the application of the Equity Lens toolkit that they're using has resulted in hundreds of changes to policies in Seattle that are aimed at achieving racial equity. So Baltimore, Maryland, working with a team from Seattle, unsurprisingly, they have begun to develop a plan to expressly address institutional and structural racism and inequity or inequality. What they did very recently is adopt 2 pieces of legislation. The first was a bill requiring city agencies to assess existing and proposed policies and practices using an equity lens. And then the second thing they did was they established an equity assistance fund. The city council passed it, and then it was approved by Baltimore voters in a citywide referendum to amend their city charter. It authorizes the establishment of a continuing non-lapsing equity assistance fund to use exclusively to assist in efforts to reduce inequity based on race, gender, and economic status in Baltimore. And actually, there's a lot of other stuff about that equity assistance fund, but I'm going to leave that there. I just thought that that was an interesting pairing for their equity lens. So what Baltimore is doing, they're taking now 4 key steps to sort of make manifest their equity lens legislation. So first, they're establishing training for city agencies on how to conduct equity assessments. That's going to be what they're going to do right off the top, the first year of implementation. Moving to focusing on the development of a plan that really codifies that action, right? So legislation specifies putting a plan in place, taking active steps, such as data mandate around disaggregated data, and third, creating an infrastructure to in sort of setting the specific roles within their local government. And then authorizing assessment and review to track the outcomes. So they're going to have some form of evaluation of progress. We don't know what that looks like yet in Baltimore, but I'm certainly going to be watching that. So San Antonio, Texas, created Diversity and Inclusion Office in 2015. They very recently, 2018, adopted their first equity budget using an equity lens, committing more resources to areas and populations where the the data showed the need was greater. It is not as comprehensive as what Seattle has done. I think this is a really great example of a first step. So in this in the 2018 budget, what San Antonio did was they did an assessment by district of the percentage of below average or failing street conditions, tree canopy, and residents who are less able to afford to put trees on their own property, need for animal care services, homeless encampments, a risk of experiencing homelessness, and the risk of flooding. And they have in the sort of pipeline, right, adding additional equity assessments by district going forward. But for their first one, these were for the individual assessments they made. And then from those assessments made allocations of resources in their budget based on the districts that the data showed needed more assistance. They also have their D&I office that they created in 2015. They have a pilot initiative, 15 hours of training they've already done for 65 city employees in 6 key departments. Government, public affairs, human resources, solid waste management, the health service, the public library. They, in that training, analyze, how you apply an equity assessment to their specific programs, and are working with those departments on creating a tool that would include collecting and analyzing the data, understanding the historical context and the need for an equity assessment, developing strategies and the community engagement around and bringing in those who are impacted, and then reporting back. So again, this looks a lot like the equity lenses that have worked in other cities. They have a 3-year strategy to fully operationalize the equity in organizations across all departments, right? Because they're just doing the pilot initiative now. And then this I thought was incredibly important. They have committed to performance metrics based on their equity goals that then feed into larger community indicators. And I'm going to expound on that in just a moment. Hey, how about a little bit of bonus content here? Tacoma, I wanted to show you a little something that Tacoma has done. It is not necessarily an equity lens as we have described it, but hold on, I have technical, okay. It's not necessarily an equity lens in the way that we've described it. It's an equity index that they have developed. Working with the Ohio State University's Kirwan Institute of Race and Social Justice, they compiled this equity index to help facilitate data-driven and data processes to enable leaders and policymakers to better distribute resources and to plan funding for services, to minimize inequities and to sort of maximize opportunities. So they have identified some broad metrics, livability, accessibility, economy, and education. And I should note that hold on. course, I'm having an issue here. So the red areas on their map sort of flips the paradigm to represent not just disparity, but to represent privilege, right? So on their map, the red areas are in fact those areas that have greater opportunity, sort of ensuring that they're thinking not just about disparity, but about who has greater access. So what I really like about this equity index is that it is starting in 2020, the equity index in Tacoma is going to become a standard feature for evaluating policy and program changes beyond fiscal impacts, right? So they're asking departments to say not just what the fiscal impacts of their program and policy changes are, but really engage with that equity index to determine what the equity impact is and define what community engagement you're doing around it. But what's most interesting to me is the tying the department goals to population level change, right? Sort of like I said with San Antonio, that they are tying their metrics to feed into larger community indicators. So rather than just measuring performance based on how many people did you serve? Was that more or fewer than last year? Asking what population level changes might we be able to see over time based on your allocation of resources. So there's a few other cities I wanted to mention. There are equity indicators that have been developed by the Institute for State and Local Governance at the City University in New York. That indicator project has been used, implemented in New York City, in St. Louis, Missouri, in Dallas, Texas, in Oakland, California, and in Oakland, California, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. So as to initially what opportunities we see here in Nashville, so I would say, first of all, we've done a lot of work and a lot of thinking in the community about this. On October 1, 2019, Metro Council unanimously passed the Community Covenant Resolution. The resolution represents the council's commitment to economic equity to ensure that all Nashvillians benefit from our city's prosperity. The Community Covenant was developed through community engagement by a whole host of local organizations and advocates, supported by the Metro Human Relations Commission. So we have an opportunity now to say, okay, the council has adopted a statement, an aspirational statement that includes equity. So how do we operationalize that, right? So let's ask council, what other action can you now take to adopt policies that give concrete mandate and action to that aspirational goal? I also think that we are in a good position to pilot some equity assessments in some key metro departments. I know that I've been working just recently with the transportation team in the mayor's office on some equity performance management, and equity assessment. I know that there are other departments, other department heads and department leadership that would be interested in piloting a program to do equity assessments, kind of the way that San Antonio has been piloting. And then finally, on January 13th, 2020, Mayor John Cooper announced that his administration has created a performance management team within the mayor's office to improve accountability and transparency. To quote the press release, the work of the performance management team will serve as a bridge between budgeting and operational management by using performance information to support budget requests and measuring performance results for the sake of financial accountability. I think, and my commission recently issued a policy recommendation pointing to the creation of a performance management program as an ideal opportunity to start building and implementing equity metrics to measure performance in some key areas, not just with regard to financial accountability as a goal, but in some key areas against population level data, and are we moving the needle? And so we feel that this is perhaps a perfect opportunity to do that. I also just want to shout out the performance measurement team has been very receptive to these ideas, very educated on how other cities are doing it. And I think that that team would benefit greatly from a mandate that includes equity in addition to financial accountability as a goal. So I think that this is an opportunity for the mayor, for Metro Council to look at how they can adopt policies that give the performance management team sort of the green light to move forward on building this system to include equity goals. That was my last slide. And I am going to look quickly at your questions.
Mel, can I answer 2 questions that I told that I would answer in the chat thread? This answer is for Oscar, who asked what were the metrics around that slide I showed with Brookings that had us in the negative inclusive ranking. What Brookings did now, I can't remember as to why it was incorporated like this, but they took Nashville, Rutherford County, and Franklin, and what they looked at was the change in the gap between the most advantaged, the top 20%, and the least advantaged, the bottom 20% in census tract. And what they looked is that they measured employment rate, median household income, and the relative poverty rate, and devised a metric to be able to show that our inclusivity was that negative process. And I can also share with Mel to send out to everybody that Metro Monitor information that Brookings did that highlighted where we are on prosperity. There's a lot of other good data within that document that can showcase where we are in Nashville within the metropolitan median area. Kate also asked a question around how do we create space for those in the community to be consistent leaders in this work? Kate, I will really tell you that the leaders in this work are already in community. They already have been advocating for this. Where we can come into play as a community of practice is that the Human Relations Commission, the Urban League of Middle Tennessee, these organizations can highlight these individuals that have already been giving us the solutions to some of these questions and make certain that they are at the table during the decision-making process. Many of these organizations, Gideon's Army, the Equity Alliance, NOAA, have been at the table for some time now, telling you from a on the boots on the ground perspective of the changes that need to be made. We just have to highlight them, support them, and having their voices lifted up and being at the table to guide the solutions to the problems that we are trying to solve right now.
Great. Thank you, Ashford. My gosh, you guys have so many good questions. A couple of quick ones. The COVID-19 report, they do now today for the first time include race and gender. I know that we've been asking, the commission and many others have been asking for the daily updates to include racial demographics. And today they do. They're not perfect, but I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get a clear demographic picture here in Nashville within the next week or 2 weeks. I hope that that data gets better. So, yeah, I'd be interested in you answering, the question, what is Nashville doing?
Was that from Khaki?
Yeah, Khaki. Will you answer that question, please? We'll read the question.
Let me pull it up. I'll read the question.
Oh, I got it for you.
Okay.
I got it for you. What is Nashville doing? What is the decision process for Nashville to commit to racial equity and put an actual process in place?
So I kind of answer that in twofold from what I've seen working with other of our peer cities, Atlanta, New Orleans, Charlotte, Raleigh, Richmond, Virginia. One of the first things that has taken place is that their mayor, their city councils have expressly said the words race. If they have expressly come out and say, we want to make certain that race does not play a factor in the opportunities for success in the residents within my city. That was some of the first that took place, is that they acknowledged publicly that race was playing a factor in the inequalities that was being experienced by many of the residents. I think next, Khaki, to that point, since 2015 up until 2018, and many of you who are on this call right now, I met with in my time in the mayor's office and mapped out what we were trying to do. Nashville, to the tune of almost $1 million, has issued 3 important studies that really showed why we needed to move forward in an equitable manner, utilizing racial equity. We issued in 2018 a disparity study that outlined the disparity in the utilization of ethnic and women minority-owned business in metro government. At the same time, we issued a metro HR study around inclusion. Many, if not all, of the department heads were a part of this study, went through the process. We began to lay out what that could actually look like. There was a third study, the Connected Nashville study, which outlines how do we utilize technology to equal equity. And we see that taking place now as many of our students are digitally not accessible to do the work necessary. We've paid for that study in the process. At that same time, working with community groups within my office and the mayor's office, we began to work to outline 8 core principles to establish what equity could look like from the mayor's office perspective. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we have transitioned. We transitioned, from the Berry administration to the Briley administration, and now to the Cooper administrations. And oftentimes, when a new administration comes in, sometimes we just wash anew and start over. I think, unfortunately, that has led to the enactment of more disparities because we haven't piggybacked off of the work that was already taking place. We have studies, we have processes, we have a roadmap that was designed that I will also again share with Mel to share out, that spells out how do we begin to address these inequities across 8 core principles that other cities are utilizing as well to make their metro government more equitable for others. What I can say right now is that we haven't put many of those policies or principles forward, but now is the opportunity. To quote, I think it was Winston Churchill and then revised by Rahm Emanuel, now is the time that we should not let a crisis go to waste. And I think now is the time that we say, you know what, we just can no longer do this. We have the data to outline it. We have the process. We have the institutional and the knowledge in the community that have given us the solutions. Now, instead of thinking of metro government as working within its own silo, we work with MNPS. We work with our business sector. We work with our nonprofit sector to build a table. We work with the community to build a table to grow this process out in an equitable manner. But the steps are there. The data is there. Now we just need the collective political, social support to move it forward.
And let me add, you're absolutely right that the research and the studies are there. Most of the data is there, at least to get us started on building an assessment that crosses sectors and that doesn't simply measure our success in a vacuum, right? That, these individual programs and projects get assessed for their, success. I think we're at a moment where we need to no longer do research on it. We need to actually implement policies that will measure what we're doing on a population level, right? Are we having an impact on the disparities that all of these studies have shown us? So, we have several questions about where do we start? How do we do this? I hope some of them were before my last slide, so I hope that helped, right? That council and the mayor's office are in a position to be able to adopt policy and mandates that include some kind of equity assessments in our performance measurement here in Metro. We can also pilot some programs or pilot assessments for some key departments. Shout out to the library, I think it was, who said we're down, sign us up.
Arts Commission has always been very supportive of this work.
Absolutely. So I know, and I want to really thank the department heads who have joined us for this. Because I would really love to partner with you all on, absent a mandate from council or the mayor's office, how can we use what resources we have and influence we have to join together to start doing this work within our own departments. So I think that's important. Now, of course, I work for Metro, so I focus a lot on what we're doing here in Metro. And that leads me to this question that Pat Helper has asked. Where'd you go, Pat? That, does the current, I think you answered one of her questions, but I do want to add to it, right? That as we're going through this particular crisis, hot on the heels of a tornado, 10 years after a flood in which most Black and Brown communities still hadn't fully, from. You know, is this the time to be talking about these big policy questions? And my answer is, this is exactly the time. We agree with Asher. We can't go back to life as normal, right? Because it's these crises that really bring to the fore the way that racial, systemic, institutional racism and inequality has worked. Quietly in the background for some who aren't paying attention, but certainly something experienced by those who are affected. So now is the time.
So I want to bring up something that is fresh and new, but this is an example of how council taking the information can lead literally right now. So yesterday, during the process, it was announced that the young lady that is in the finance department, and forgive me for not remembering her name, she is overseeing or looking at the $120 million that is coming to Nashville for the CARES Act. While that is important, we know that is going to be part of a package that several restrictions are on that money. It can be spent to utilize to fill in current budget gaps that have not been affecting from COVID. The money must be spent to address COVID-based relief efforts, so to speak. The money must be spent by the end of this year, right? But there was a question from a council member that came up, Councilman O'Connell. What is the transparency around that? Like, how do we as council members make certain that we are involved in that process? Again, this is $120 million that is coming. And the reason, it's important to note that the reason Nashville is getting upwards of $120 million along with Memphis is because of the census tract data that tells us we have over 500,000 residents here. So when you think about that money coming, think about it in the terms of, if we look at it from the data of the census tract, how much of that money will be coming back into communities of color, right? If we are paying attention, and if we ask and work with the mayor's office as a council and a community to say, these are our tax dollars coming in to help the COVID relief that we know is doubly affecting African-American immigrant community members. How can we put an equity lens? How do we have conversations around equity, around this tax dollar money that is coming into the city, right? I think that is a vital, important first step that our advocacy community can reach out to, talking to our council members to say, we want to make certain that you, as our council representative, understand the process and understand, like, how is this relief money going to benefit all the communities within our city?
So a question asked, Commissioner Lethea Mann has asked, has the idea of using an equity lens been discussed with the mayor in future budgets? My answer is yes. We issued a policy recommendation. I've had some conversations with the mayor's office. Another related question was what kind of trainings could we expect, or could we ask for council members on building an equity assessment, and have there been any? You're at the first one. All of you joining us here, council members were invited, and hopefully, if they were not able to join us today, that hopefully you will encourage your council member to view the recording as a first step in training about what an equity lens is. I know that my office, we're going to make the PowerPoint available along with this recording. But what we're also going to do is sort of flesh it out further. Right. So I know Clifton Harris asked, could I share more information about the Equity Assistance Fund? what city was doing? Baltimore. And yes, so I anticipate following this particular training that I'll build a little toolkit for you all that expands on all of the topics and provide you with access to the resources and links to information. And we will make that available hopefully just in the next week or week and a half. Amy asked, what the change teams in Seattle, were they government employees or general members of the community? I think in Seattle, they were government employees inside the departments, but I don't see any reason why a change team within a department couldn't make, as part of their engaging stakeholders and communities personally affected, have a member or members on their change team. I think that would be a really interesting innovation. Another question is what sort of data, and I think Commissioner Vennick asked, what research has been done on the impact of the equity lens process in other cities. I know that because Seattle had started this so early, that they do have some outcome-driven assessments that I will share in the sort of greater toolkit. But I've certainly heard repeatedly that it has affected hundreds of policies and programs and initiatives and budget decisions. So I'll see if there isn't a good link to a study or whatever assessment they've done.
So to Erwin's point, I will link him with the Living Cities Foundation. So a lot of the southern cities of our peer cities are really just beginning to do this work, right? So there may be studies on the horizon, but as we look right now, we're talking about, we see racialized policies taking place back in 1816. We see these policies coming forward. So we have to look at it in a sense. We won't see a drastic decrease in the racial wealth gap within a year, within a 2-year frame. Like, we are talking about systems and policies that have been in place for decades upon decades. But I do think that we can analyze how these processes and policies being implemented over time versus some that are just program work. But everybody is so young in this process of really, because equity as a process is going to have to be evaluated over and over again. We're going to have to look at today, the intention of this policy may seem well. 3 years down the road, we may see we need to tinker with that a little bit because it didn't get the adjusted outcome that we wanted to see. So I think the Living Cities has the best kind of idea around the equity atlas and how they're trying to frame having the data to show success rates of these policies that have been passed.
Yes. I see 2 questions I want to address. What changes in administration in Metro government, like where is the best place for an equity lens to live? Clifton asks. To Ashford, and he said, right, to Ashford's point, right, what we have seen here in Nashville, I've had 4 mayors in 5 years. I've been in Metro government for 5 years, 4 mayors. So we do all this work and then it gets shelved. So I think that it's important to find ways to embed the progress that we make in structures in Metro that aren't wiped out by an election, right? So I think when you think about the performance measurement team within the mayor's office, my understanding is, right, that with a new mayor, that might not be a program that continues, right? So how do we embed progress that we make? So I think one of the best recommendations I can make is to do the policy so that there's collaboration between departments too, right? So if you say, look, performance measurement is going to be embedded eventually in planning or in finance or wherever it's best, accommodated, but it's working in collaboration with and building an equity lens with the Metro Human Relations Commission and with whatever other departments have really stepped up on this, right? So build it so we have to work together and embed it so it outlasts the sort of winds of politics.
Something else that other cities have done is they have codified either the position of equity officer or they have codified their Human Relations Commission to be an extension of the mayor's office. That is where the equity process takes place in conjunction with their HR departments. But in a lot of other cities, they have codified the equity model, the equity lens model to be a part of their government within their charters moving forward.
Yeah, and actually, that's precisely how Seattle did it, right? The office that did all that work, frankly, looks a lot like your Metro Human Relations Commission, with more staff and more resources, but with a clear mandate around how that office leads the city on issues of equity and works with the mayor's office. Okay, what other, hold on, let me look at some of these other questions real quick. Oh, you guys have so many good questions. So Pat asked, can we bring the organizations together that have been looking at these issues in some sort of roundtable or something to bring more pressure? Yes. I will tell you that before COVID-19 shutdown, there had been some discussion at the table the steering committee for a voice for the reduction of poverty, and a couple of other tables that I sit at and groups that I collaborate with to do sort of a follow-up for what we did last April. Right? If you all recall, I think many of you joined us for a sort of symposium we did on the sort of dignity of work, and it was called Nashville Rising. And so we had talked about doing a follow-up for Nashville Rising to focus on an equity lens, how the community can get involved in building that lens and putting the sort of pressure that only community members can to get a policy adopted. So we will definitely, Pat, continue. This is just the beginning of the conversation.
I also want to say, we have a tremendous amount of quality, caring, empathetic, and understanding council members that need to hear from us, right? I think council has the opportunity to be a leader in this space. That is particularly why they're elected to be legislative representatives of the community in which people live. I think leaning upon the council members, showing them support for, yes, this is what we mean. This is why this is important. We want you to do A, B, and C is vital to them. Council members, need our support to give them a little nudge every now and then, but we have more than enough capable council members that have been talking about this, because at the time that we talk also about budget cuts and the need to support what's taking place now, we have to prepare for what the future looks like. That also includes talking about resilience and how does the resiliency conversation fit into this conversation. When we started the 100 Rockefellers Foundation within the mayor's office, I'm not sure if we took it as seriously as we needed to, because everyone was probably like, natural disasters come and go. What does that really mean? We're not in the space of that. Well, Nashville, just within the last 4 months, has had a tornado, now COVID response, right? In the midst of a 10-year anniversary of a flood. These natural disasters are occurring more and more frequently. So we have to set a strategy. I am big on looking at a system strategy to address these. What we don't need to do in this time is just continue to do one piecemeal, segmented, siloed efforts, right? We have to pull people together at this point in time. And I know everybody is tired of these Zoom meetings, these WebEx meetings, just like I am. But we have to make certain that we are integrating efforts, right? We can no longer work in a silo if we want to see systematic changes moving forward.
And I also just want to add that, and you really spoke to this, Ashford, that, simply adopting a set of questions that we then impose on departments through the budget process and then, have them report on it, doesn't get us there, right? So before we get there, you have to do a lot of work on the front end, some of which we have not done yet, right? So being really clear about, if we're going to do this, like, what are the key equity metrics and goals that we want to address? Because we can't do everything at one time. So what are these key goals, right? Sort of like Tacoma on their index. Remember, it was like accessibility, right? Like they had really focused on this is what we're going to start with. Then the kinds of training that it will take within departments on how to do an assessment. Then you got to build the assessment. But we have good examples of that. That's less concerning to me. But build capacity within departments on how to do the assessment.
Yep.
Then, how is that reported? And like I said, I think we have a decent opportunity to look at the performance measurement plan and how we could incorporate it. Now, absent that, I think Councilwoman or Councilperson Berkeley Allen, right? Would it be appropriate to add specific equity questions to the department performance metrics? They're found on Metro's finance website. Yes, but I want to ensure that we're clear on what those equity metrics are and that departments can do an assessment, do real community engagement. And somebody asked about community engagement. And I'll tell you, one reason I really like an equity lens as a tool is that built into every single equity lens and every model I have seen is you got to be real clear about what communities are affected and what kind of engagement substantively have you done with those communities. And so it sort of builds it into the process. Ashford, I know you might want to speak to that.
No, I think that's vitally important. And what we see, the movement coming from this equity push has been to lead somewhat in various ways, with the community being the foundation of this conversation, because for so long the community has been left out of this conversation as we have tried to come in from top down to say, we are here to help you, these are the solutions, just operate with us. Well, I think the community has been outlining the solutions for so long now. We need to give them voice to come in and help us to create this space moving forward. But I think the community engagement, legitimate community engagement, is vital for us to really move this forward. The community will bring the solutions forward, and the community will support the council members, the mayor, the HRC in doing this. But in that process, what we will have to grow is trust. Right now, across the country,
yes,
the trust capital with government is at an all-time low. And I'm grateful that we live in a city where at least we have the mayor that is taking into consideration science and information as like how we make decisions. We can't say that all the way from the federal level, at the state level right now. Building that trust means showing community that when they give us the solutions, we will enact on them and we will give voice to their solutions and concerns.
Yeah, and just to add one other thing on that, I think a question Sharmila asked, how are you going to engage in these conversations with community stakeholders, right? What kind of questions would you use to get folks speaking about their experience? And let me say, first of all, I think that any good equity lens that's adopted and a toolkit around it is going to be some best practices for community engagement, right? So not having the same exact people at the table every time, and not, how do we go out into the community rather than expecting the community to come into the mayor's office or into metro government? When are we going to do it? It's probably not going to be between 9 and 5. And so I would view any good toolkit or lens and training to include some promising practices around that engagement.
I would also say, which we often forget about, but with the trust capital being low, that any type of equity lens, any type of equitable process that we set out with community has to also have a communications plan in conjunction with that. I think we have to communicate we have to communicate what we're trying to achieve at the beginning, and along the way, we have to set timeline and milestones to let the community know where we are in the process. We have to have a communications plan across sectors, across religions, across race, across zip codes, to let people know what we're trying to accomplish and where we are to go to accomplishing what we have set out. That is so vitally important in building trust and for people to build buy-in, to continue to believe that there are outcomes that people are trying to see for them in a better light.
No, that's exactly right. And I just need to pile on that for 1 second, right? I have heard from many, many community members, I'm tired of coming to Metro and telling them, sharing my experience, telling them how to fix X, Y, or Z, sharing my expertise for free. And then you don't do anything with it. I don't see a result from having done that. So having that communication plan and a commitment to the community to show, look, we want to use this information for these results. And we want to be able to show you and be accountable. Okay, so let me make sure. Training for community members as well. Yes. I think in line with what Pat asked, Yeah, I think a symposium or some roundtable discussions on this issue. I think that I envision the Metro Human Relations Commission partnering with some community folks to do those in the future. Maybe by web, as long as we are working from home. But yes, we will do that. So unless you have any final thoughts, Ashford, and let me say apologies to anybody who had a question that was not addressed. You can email or call me anytime and I'll be happy to talk about it.
No, again, I want to thank you for sparking this timely conversation, thanking the people that are on the call and those that had to leave early for being on this call. Right now, we saw yesterday in the budget, like we are at a crucial time in our city, but this is really not the time to fret. This is the time for us to envision bigger, to see what our city can be like. I know he's not here with us anymore, but Reverend Barnes would be asking us right now, what type of city do we really want to be? And I think if we look to Reverend Barnes as an example of being a beloved community, of what Dr. King wanted to be a beloved community, we see that we have to be equitable in the way that we respond to the needs of those in our community. And now is the time, in the midst of change, in the midst of opportunity, in the midst of uncertainty, to really drive forward the type of city that we want to be moving forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashford, for your time today, and for all of you. For those who I work with regularly in the community, let me just tell you that I miss you. And I look forward to continuing this work. Let's not let this challenge slow us down. Let's grab a hold of this moment to move forward. So thank you. I'll send out a link to the recording when it's ready. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.net.